Coming up on today's episode of the All Aboard podcast, we hit the big 5-0, and we will be doing a magazine throwback for Trains Magazine of April 1980. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who hopes to one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the first time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, first of all, I've got to apologize to a lot of you out there, whether you're on our audio podcast, whether you are on CP5 Cam. I have not been around for the past almost week, and we had a little bit of difficulty here because we had to figure out how to appropriately stream this. And so I'm going to try to stream as many of these as possible to our YouTube channel and then subsequently release them over on audio. So you'll be getting everything on Mondays, Wednesdays, and then those times during the week when we do Thursdays for book reviews and so on. So you'll be able to get it live if you're able to join us on YouTube, and then you will get it recorded or tape delay, as they used to say in the 1980s, through our other outlets. And so you are all important. We are glad you're able to do that. And by the way, I wanted to make sure for those of you who are with us on CP5 Cam that you are getting the best possible background and camera angle and you name it. So that is what I have been up to here at the All Aboard podcast. So thank you so much for taking a little bit of time with me and letting us get you an even better product than we have been offering you to this point. Now, it is June, and since it's June, the first thing we got to do is go to the 2024 All Aboard Railroad calendar by All Things Trains. And so let me get for you our picture of that calendar. And here you go. This was actually taken by my good friend and somebody who has been an absolutely loyal listener to this program, Nicolee Ambrose. And she is out of Maryland, but she also started her, used to live in Western Springs, Illinois, and that's where this photo comes from, Western Springs, Illinois, which is located on BNSF's Chicago subdivision, which is best known as the racetrack, And so that's where Metra operates between Chicago and Aurora on the former Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. And also they are joined by Amtrak, who operates out to out to Oakland, with the California Zephyr. They operate to Los Angeles with the Southwest Chief that was rerouted between Galesburg and Chicago over this route after the BNSF merger. And they also operate the Carl Sandburg and Illinois Zephyrs as part of the Illinois service. So Western Springs is an amazing place to watch trains because not only do you have a ton of passenger trains, but you also have a lot of great BNSF freights that come through. And that can be everything from coal to intermodal, general merchandise, even the office car special once in a while, you name it. Now, the best thing about Western Springs is what you see to the right of the train, and that is Western Springs Water Tower. Now, it has a very iconic water tower, which at one point also served as offices for the town. So it's there is, if you look very closely to that image, there are some areas where the windows, that's where the offices are located. Of course, the water tower right above it, and it is really a beautiful building and a great backdrop. In fact, on the 2021 version of the calendar, which we will have on our new website when it is launched, which should be the beginning of next week, we have some old issues there, but it was actually on the cover with a Metra train there. But Nicolee was there and she said, hey, I had to take this picture, and I think it's a terrific one. So shout out to her. She made June look absolutely outstanding. And so we are glad that she is on board with us. So if you are on CP5 Cam on Rumble or YouTube, please check it out. And we will have a few bonus issues of the calendar that we make available later this summer for some of our trivia questions, which we're going to start working in as the podcast unfolds a little bit more. And now to the main event. So what I wanted to do was another opportunity for a magazine throwback. And as you know, I love magazines. And so what I always encourage you to do is go get your old copies of Trains Magazine, Model Railroader, Passenger Train Journal, CTC Board, you name it, anything that is a rail magazine, whether we're talking about The Real Thing, Models, more industry journal, or more rail fan focused, do that and build your library. Yes, it does take up space, but is very much worth it for the simple fact that you are going to get so much information that was put together in real time about the history of our industry. You're going to get a lot of things that are right. You're going to get a few things that are wrong, but it will help you with your knowledge. And that, of course, is why we're here at All Things Trains. And we are going to have a number of those magazines from time to time for sale through our mainline mall portion of our website. And so, as I said, next couple of weeks, when that site is launched, you'll be able to get it, and you'll be able to get it for great prices, because we don't believe in taking all of your money, just all of the money that you might have otherwise spent on things that aren't train related. So the cover of this is what I think is the most interesting. And rather than show you my personal copy there, let's see, for those of you who are on CP5 cam, let's see if we can't get you a better image of that, because the cover for me is really where I started with this. And the reason why, just as a recap, as I bring this up, why we do this is simple. Like I said, we want to talk a lot about history, but it's not just for the sake of talking about history. It's for the sake of talking about history in the context of where things have gone for railroading in the years since this was created, since this magazine was published. And that also gives an insight into how things have developed in the current way. So that way, as you look back at this, you'll say, okay, now I understand where that came from. So right there on the cover, you see Amtrak's Floridian. The Floridian, of course, operated between Chicago, Miami, and St. Petersburg, and it was originally the Pennsylvania Railroad South Wind. Amtrak took this service over, which at the time in May of 1971 did not go all the way to Chicago, because Penn Central, who had succeeded the Pennsylvania Railroad, had broken the connection between at Louisville, where it originally turned the train over to the Louisville and Nashville. And then the L&N would take the train south to Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, and at Montgomery, the Atlantic Coastline, which was the controlling shareholder for most of Louisville and Nashville's life, would take the train over and then take it into Florida, where for a time it operated down the Florida East Coast to Miami, and later on a joint Atlantic Coastline Seaboard Airline route, Jacksonville to Auburndale, Florida on the Atlantic Coastline, Auburndale, Florida to Miami on the Seaboard Airline, after the Florida East Coast went on strike in 1963, and that all but ended passenger service for decades. There were some trains that did operate, but very small. Now, Amtrak took over in 1971. As I said, Penn Central had broken the connection. Therefore, you were not actually able to ride the train between Chicago and Miami. You're able to ride the train between Louisville and Miami. And then they decided to bring it back, and they brought it back by running over the Illinois Central and the New York Central, which by then was owned by the Penn Central for a while, to get to the Pennsylvania. And it ended up hopscotching, that's a term we love to use, across the state of Indiana to try to figure out how to get from Chicago down to Louisville and then ultimately South Florida. Now, why is this important, and why did I care so much? Because first of all, when you look back at the cover there, you see it's a great picture, and great pictures were so much of what all of the magazines in the 1970s and 1980s did so well in the railfan context, and this just drew you in. So you see this, I believe that was actually taken on the L&N with a couple of SDP-40Fs at front. And this was significant because with me, it also gave me an introduction into what the SDP-40F was. This was Amtrak's first new locomotive that they purchased, and these are 3,000 horsepower cowl-bodied versions of the SD-40-2, and there is a picture of the third SDP-40F, number 502-500 was the class unit. Generally, the way that EMD did things, strangely enough, some other locomotive was the first delivered. So this may have been, we don't know. But these were very interesting because they were designed to be very, very similar as much as possible to the SD-40 and SD-40-2, which were very well regarded freight locomotives at the time. And this way, in the event that Amtrak failed, or so the story goes, that the SDP-40Fs could be repurposed as freight locomotives. Now, eventually this would happen in a small way, where the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe purchased a number of them and called them SDF-40-2s, and ended up adding switching steps and expanding the front platform with handrails so that they could be used the same way as the Santa Fe's FP45s after they were put into the freight pool, and all of your typical second generation freight diesels that they used on mainline services. Now, the reason that happened, though, is because the SDP-40F, while it looked like a great locomotive, while by all accounts it really was a great locomotive, there was a time where the SDP-40Fs could not stay on the track on certain railroads. The Milwaukee Road was an example. The Burlington Northern was a railroad that decided they were going to put heavy restrictions on the use of the SDP-40Fs. And at the time, the belief was, and I will go back over the shot for those of you on CP5 cam, that the trucks under these locomotives, which are called Flexicoil HTC, that they were somehow built poorly, and therefore they were causing the locomotives to derail. And there never has been a very good explanation of what caused these derailments, with the exception that most of them tended to take place on railroads like the Penn Central and the Milwaukee Road that were either bankrupt or experiencing extreme financial difficulty, and therefore not spending a whole lot of money on track maintenance. That, by the way, for those who've been consistent listeners, is why we always stress the importance of railroad profits, in that those profits make it possible to invest heavily in the infrastructure. And when you're not able to do that, you end up with bad track at the very least. And that, of course, is fatal to a railroad. Now, the SDP-40Fs didn't last very long as the leaders of Amtrak's trains, because what they started to do was trade them into EMD, Electromotive Division, who built them in the first place. And what EMD did is took the vast majority of them, took the engines out, which were 16-cylinder 645 E-series prime movers. So that's the 645, 645 cubic inches of displacement per cylinder, 16 cylinders, and the E block. So that was the first block that was used in the 645. You'll remember the D block was used on the 567s in the GP35s and GP30s. They took the E block engines, so the long blocks, it's everything in them, plus the electric generators and 4 of the 6 traction motors, and would generally recycle them into F40 PHs, which were basically the same thing from a horsepower standpoint, except they were 4 axles rather than 6, and they also had a much smaller, or actually not a much smaller fuel capacity. I should apologize, because the SDP-40Fs, as with SDP-45s and many of EMD's locomotives in the steam generator era, actually had a fuel tank that was partitioned. So a portion of the tank actually carried water, the remainder carried fuel. And so the fuel capacities, whether we're talking about the SDP-40Fs, the E units, so that's my beloved E8s, your F7s and so on, they actually did have relatively small fuel tanks when compared to the 3,000 gallons or even 4,000 gallon fuel tanks you'll find on newer locomotives, or I believe it's 4,500 there, because the tanks were partitioned, and therefore a lot of that had to be used for water, because steam generators, which produce the steam that would heat the passenger cars, and most certainly are doing that in the cars on the cover of the magazine we're looking at here, they consumed a lot of water. And that, for those who are interested, is a flash boiler. And that's something that you can get nowadays as a hot water heater in your home. Basically, it takes cold water, spins it around a heating element, and it quickly becomes steam or quickly becomes hot. That's the way that the steam generators worked in the diesel electric locomotives. Of course, this replaced the steam heat that would be taken directly from the boiler of a steam locomotive back when we had steam engines, until you got to the late 1930s and diesel electric started to take over. Now, going past the front cover, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it a little bit different from how we normally do, is I'm just going to open up and go through this because I think that actually makes it more interesting. On the page number 3, which was David P. Morgan's column where he would do his editorializing in trains every month, news and editorial comment, there was a big surprise, and that was the merger of the Union Pacific and the Missouri Pacific, which was announced in January of 1980. Now, this was surprising for several reasons. First of all, because David P. Morgan didn't know about it, and he, being somebody that was truly a veteran and a guiding light of the rail industry press. For him to have been caught off guard shows you to what extent that this proceeded with a lot of secrecy. Now, if you listen to our book review of Merging Lines, where they talked extensively about a lot of the railroad mergers that took place between the 1950s and the Conrail, or before the Conrail division, early 1980s, you know that the Missouri Pacific and the Southern Railway had been negotiating a merger, but they could not come to an agreement on leadership. And so this broke down. Now, there is a widespread belief, and I don't know if we can ever confirm this or not, that the Missouri Pacific and the Southern, they were more taking a break. So think about a relationship you have the woman you love and you say, oh, hey, let's take a break for a little while. And we all know what that means is usually you're just going to break up. And that's ended up what happened here with the Missouri Pacific and the Southern, because while they were on a break from the negotiations, what happened? Well, the Union Pacific swooped in. Now, remember, at the time, the Union Pacific was not just the Union Pacific Railroad. It was controlled by the Union Pacific Corporation, which had been created as a holding company for the railroad, but it on its own had extensive holdings in a wide variety of other businesses, including natural resources. And this is something that we would see also happen over with Burlington Northern, because that's where Burlington Resources came from. And you may have seen some pictures of their aircraft, and we actually highlighted it a few episodes back. I think that was back in season 1, because of their extensive natural resource holdings as well. And so this was also happening at a time when there was concern that railroads might be nationalized, especially as you started to see a number of them collapse. And then this intensified during the Penn Central era. So railroad shareholders, even though the primary business of these companies, and this was the case with the Union Pacific, was railroading, they were also very attuned to the fact that either they could lose the railroad because the government might take it away from them, or B, they could just see continued deterioration in the ability of the railroads to earn a very good return, yes, a profit, and therefore they might want to concentrate more resources, more of the cash the railroad throws off, on other things that do not have those twin threats holding over it. But as Morgan points out in this, it really did show that the Union Pacific, because they were going to take over the Missouri Pacific, that they were remaining committed to railroading and that they would be investing in the system in a very large way. Now, what's so interesting about this comes in the first couple of paragraphs. The Union Pacific at the time, the Union Pacific Railroad, was 9,420 route miles. Now, if you're like me and you don't own a single route mile, that's a lot. But the Missouri Pacific at the time was 11,277 route miles. Now, it's very difficult for a lot of us to think of the Missouri Pacific as being a much larger railroad than the Union Pacific itself, after all, because UP has the overland route. It goes to places like Cheyenne, Wyoming, Omaha, Nebraska, Ogden, Utah, going up to Portland, Oregon, and then down to Los Angeles via shared track arrangement with the Santa Fe. So you think about all those places and wow, that's a lot of space, covers a big portion of the country, which is true. But at the time, the Missouri Pacific was larger. Why? Well, first of all, it always had an extensive Granger network. So we're talking about Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, and so on. They got down to the Gulf Coast, through Texas, into Louisiana, but then also out to Arizona as well. So this is where you had, New Mexico, Tucumcari. Wait, am I saying that right? West Texas, El Paso. I was getting a little bit confused with the Rock Island, so please forgive me. It's been a couple of days, but yes, getting into West Texas, where they would connect with the Southern Pacific, and that created traffic that went out, traffic patterns that took it all the way out to the West Coast, Los Angeles, and so forth. But remember, they also had a very extensive Texas network from railroads like the Texas and Pacific, and the International Great Northern, because at one time, any railroad that operated in Texas had to be incorporated in Texas. So a lot of the out-of-state carriers, whether it was the Southern Pacific with the Texas and New Orleans, or, of course, the Missouri Pacific, with a number of them, including the TNP and the IGN, had subsidiaries that were based in Texas, even though for all practical purposes, they were part of the larger company. Let's also remember that they helped to divide the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, which expanded their network in the Midwest, and that was divided with the L&N. They actually took over the CNEI, and then a portion of that, which is the line to Evansville from Dalton, Illinois, that is now CSX's property. And that is also where CSX will operates as part of a shared track arrangement. It's CE and D subdivision going into Chicago. So that's where you'll actually see CSX and Union Pacific trains on the same route going in and out. So that gives you an idea of how the Missouri Pacific got to have that heft. And then what also made it an attractive takeover target for the Union Pacific because, of course, a lot of that extensive chemical business, but also an entry into Chicago, which the Union Pacific at the time did not have. And let's also not forget that extensive Granger network in the Midwest. So again, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, and so on, which was an important addition to Union Pacific's overall traffic mix. Now, Morgan was surprised by this, but there was one more surprise they had in store for him, and that was taking over the 1,482-mile Western Pacific. Now, remember, since the Southern Pacific was cut loose from the Union Pacific in the early 1900s as part of trust-busting efforts, the Union Pacific did not have its own direct route to the Bay Area, California. So San Francisco, Oakland, and it moved the majority of its traffic using what was called the Pacific Railroad Conditions. And this was an arrangement where UP would put traffic on the Southern Pacific at Salt Lake City, but really Ogden, Utah, and it would go west from there. Now, at Ogden, Salt Lake City, of course, the Western Pacific connection. This worked fine for a while, but then as time went on, it ended up becoming inconvenient for both railroads. Became inconvenient for the Southern Pacific because the Southern Pacific, after taking over the Central Pacific, it ended up having a network all the way through the Southwest. And we're talking about points like El Paso, San Antonio, Houston, and then the Cotton Belt, the St. Louis Southwestern, that goes up through Arkansas and into St. Louis. So it had the ability to get a lot of this traffic to East Coast connections without turning it over to the Union Pacific after a relatively short haul. And at the same time, the Union Pacific had to turn traffic over to SP, which meant they were not able to get as long a haul. We'll enter the Western Pacific. This was supposed to be part of a transcontinental railroad that involved the Rio Grande, Denver and Rio Grande Western, the Wabash, because let's not forget, the Wabash actually went out as far as Omaha, Nebraska. The Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific bridged the gap between Omaha and the Rio Grande at Denver. And then you have going east from the Wabash, you have the Wheeling and Lake Erie and the Pittsburgh in West Virginia, which was called the Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal. And then you have connection through the Pittsburgh in West Virginia to the Western Maryland, which when you put it all together, you have a railroad that stretches from Baltimore all the way to Oakland, Baltimore, Maryland to Oakland, California. Well, unfortunately, and this being the brainchild of Jay Gould, unfortunately, they were not able to financially maintain control of all these railroads, and just about everybody went their own separate way. But that left the Western Pacific, and the Western Pacific had a terrific arrangement going with the Denver and Rio Grande Western, as well as Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, which created a route between the Midwest and the West Coast. Well, suddenly now the Union Pacific steps in, they take it over, and that is what surprises Morgan. So there's a lot of discussion in this issue about that. Now, going on beyond that, we find out there is also another extensive merger-related discussion, and that came with respect to the Penn Central. Now, we're talking about April 1980 trains. So, the Penn Central by this point had been gone for exactly 4 years by the time this magazine hit the newsstand. So, April 1st, 1976, Penn Central ceases rail operations. The majority of it does get conveyed to Conrail. But there was a question, well, how much is the Penn Central actually worth? And Morgan discusses a lot of the conversation that's going on here. And the Penn Central was looking at a figure of $4 to $5 billion, because by this point, the USRA, in this case, the United States Railway Association, had to figure out how to value those properties and come to an agreement with Penn Central. Even though Penn Central no longer had possession of them, they were going to get paid for it in some way. Now, initially, they, along with the other bankrupt rail estates, and that's Erie, Lackawanna, Reading, Jersey Central, Lehigh Valley, and so on, received certificates from the United States that were to be exchanged eventually for the money that they would be paid for these properties. But again, they had to figure out how to value them. And this is where a lot of very, very difficult conversations had to take place. Number one, the government did have a lot of these all these carriers over a barrel, because the answer is, hey, look, you were losing money. You were losing money by the trainload. And literally, that's not just a colloquialism. And so what we did is we took from you the burden of losing money hand over fist in exchange for these assets. So we're going to try to pay you as little as possible. The bankrupt railroads all operating, or almost all operating, under either a bankruptcy trustee or a receiver. You had multiple parties there, so that's your debt holders, but also the counsel for them and the judges who are looking to get as much as absolutely possible, because that's what they have to do. The debt holders, because of course they lent large sums of money to these railroads, whether we're talking about as debtor in possession financing, which is what came about after the bankruptcies were declared, or in the many years before the bankruptcies, when these railroads were losing money and running up big debts in order to try to stay in business, because not only did they have to, but there was also no idea of how things could be reorganized in a profitable way for the most part. So I want to be clear, I don't think there was no understanding about how it could be done. There was just very little understanding among those who were there about how it could be done. So they talk about it, and the government at this point, as per the magazine, wanted to pay about $650 million for the Penn Central properties they took over. Penn Central, on the other hand, was saying the number should be closer to between $4 and $5 billion in 1980. I'm inclined to go with the Penn Central because, remember, while Penn Central certainly was losing a lot of money and very much was under the threat of shutting down completely, you have to remember that all of those assets, and we're talking about metal, we're talking about operable locomotives, we're talking about inoperable locomotives, passenger cars, freight cars, and land that could not in that day, and sadly in this one, in many cases, ever be have a right of way replicated on it. That is what tends to jack up the price, and that is also why it becomes very difficult even now if you want to buy what you might consider to be a railroad that doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of business on it. So that discussion was taking place. Now, at the same time, you go to page 6, Don Phillips in his Potomac Pundit column talks about how much money the federal government had spent in recent years on railroading overall. And that was to subsidize, that was for Amtrak, that was for Conrail. And that really struck me because the number in his headline is $11,215,024,000 as of press time that the federal government had spent in subsidizing any of these, the rail industry in general, since 1970. And he has a really interesting breakdown. $4.2 billion in direct grants to Amtrak, and this is a quote, including $3,296,500,000 in operating subsidies and payments of $86 million toward the $129 million purchase price of the Northeast Corridor. That's a whole nother story for another episode. To freight carriers other than Conrail, $505,100,000 in direct grants that had been forgiven, mostly went to Penn Central, $483,200,000 in direct loans, federal loans, $308,830,000 in federal purchase of railroad trustee certificates or preference shares. And now that is largely to Penn Central because that was one of the ways the trustees continued to finance the operation, even though Penn Central continued to lose money as it went on. And then, of course, we get to Conrail, which was $3.1 billion by that point. Now, if those numbers make your head spin, and even in 2024, they should, here's a list of other railroads that did not include the carriers that came parts of Conrail that ended up with some kind of subsidy. Boston and Maine, Chicago and Northwestern, Milwaukee Road, Rock Island, Columbus and Greenville, Delaware and Hudson, Illinois Central Gulf, and the Missouri, Kansas, Texas. And it says at this time, in addition, first-time applications are pending from Auto Train, Indiana Harbor Belt, and Peoria and Pekin Union. So the fact that you had so many railroads that were on public assistance, they're living in public housing, in the projects, the financial projects or the economic projects, so to speak, gives you an idea of what the 1970s really were like and why it was so difficult in railroad terms. Also why, although you as a rail enthusiast, most certainly I as a rail enthusiast, might go back and, really look at these days as days we wish were still here, because we're sick of seeing wide cab GEVOs and Norfolk Southern's paint scheme's kind of boring, and BNSF is too much orange and everything else that you might come up with, all of which, by the way, I agree with. The reality is that it was a very, very difficult time, and it is not something that most employees, most executives, and most certainly investors don't want any part of. And as taxpayers, and we are all taxpayers, I doubt that we really would want to throw bad money or worse money after bad in order to subsidize those railroads, however much we might love their paint schemes or the equipment that they were running. Now, going on to page 16 in the railroad news photos, there was this, and this is the photo that makes me feel very old. That is Amtrak AEM7 number 900 being tested, and it's rolling through Principio, Maryland. Now, this was during the testing phase that was happening with these before they were deployed fully on the Northeast Corridor. Now, why is this important? Now, for many years, the GG1 was the backbone of transportation on the Northeast Corridor. The Pennsylvania Railroad built these in the 1930s and the 1940s. Some were built by Baldwin. The majority were built by Pennsylvania Railroad on a similar design. Now, the GG1s were used extensively. They were very reliable. They were very successful. And by the time you got to the 1970s, they were very much worn out. Not only that, but Amtrak, as part of the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, was increasing the speeds. And so one of the goals was to be able to operate at 125 miles per hour consistently on large portions of the corridor. In order to do that, they were going to need new locomotives. Now, the first locomotives that Amtrak tested and was very hopeful would work out were the General Electric E60s. These were 6-axle, 6-motor, very sleek-looking locomotives with a big snub nose. And if you go back to some of our episodes on Amtrak, you can see some really neat pictures of E60s. I, growing up, remember seeing them at the head of the Silver Star or Silver Meteor when we were riding them, and I just thought they were amazing. There was only one problem. As Paul Reistrup said, it was something like, it's trying to do a shimmy and a shake at the same time. And well, that was because the trucks that were used were actually freight locomotive trucks, the same thing you might find under a General Electric U36C, something that was going to max out around 65 miles per hour while it was pulling a freight train. And so it was not at all going to work to move those locomotives at 125 miles an hour. And attempts to do that led to derailment. So therefore, they ended up being restricted to about 90 miles per hour with a maximum overspeed at 93, as I was told. So Amtrak needed something new. And so what they came up with, after interviewing, so to speak, a variety of locomotives, including one from France, and then another called the RC4, that was built by Ozzy, ASEA. That's how Paul Reistrup pronounces it. I am not going to attempt to give you the Swedish pronunciation of either of those words, any of those words, but it translates to General Electric Company of Sweden. But EMD, Electromotive Division, ended up building American versions of the RC4 under license at LaGrange, Illinois, and this was the first one. Now, of course, we know that would eventually meet its end in Maryland in the 1987 Chase train accident, but at the time, this was the new thing, and so there it is, testing. The crazy part, why it makes me feel old, is, of course, I remember going through this book, this magazine. Now, of course, I was doing it in the early 1990s, but the AEM7 was still very much a workhorse, and it was the thing that you expected to see pulling modern passenger trains when you were in the part of the country where the most modern and hyped passenger trains were in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, of course, all the AEM7s are no longer operating, and there are 3 of them, at least in museums, plus 2 out in the West Coast on Caltrain, and Marche still has its AEM7 sitting on a siding right by CSX's Riverside Yard in Baltimore. If you're driving up on I-95, they are visible from there, and we're hoping that they end up getting preserved or seeing some kind of a second life, even if it is cab cars, because while as a rail enthusiast who is upset at his parents for not having him earlier so he could experience the GG1. There is something special about the AEM7 having been the locomotive that saved Amtrak. Now, another thing that is in the railroad news photos, not this photo exactly, but something a little bit similar, is that of an Oneida and Western SD40-2. There's only one thing. That's actually not an Oneida and Western SD40-2 because the Oneida and Western was abandoned long before any SD40-2s were even a gleam in the eye of Dick Dilworth or any of the folks running EMDs, running Electromotive Division. That's because this locomotive belongs to the Shamrock Coal Company, and this was an effort that was going on at the time that was done by a variety of companies, Detroit Edison being the other that is notable in doing so, in purchasing their own equipment and their own locomotives in order to obtain better carriage, better movement of the coal that they needed. Detroit Edison being utility, Oneida and Western being a coal company, to destinations. And so basically what their thought was, if we provide the railroads who aren't giving us the service that we want with a complete train consist that includes locomotives that they understand, and they run this only for our benefit at all, no other reason, then we will be able to not only gain better service, but we'll gain better rates. And so this is something that Shamrock Coal did into the 1980s. Eventually that stopped and the locomotives got split up, as did the hopper cars, but it did make for an interesting sight. And the reason for the green paint, the very interesting green paint, is that the president of Shamrock Coal at the time apparently really liked the color green, so this is what they ended up with. Now, it's important to remember, like I said, the original Oneida and Western had long been abandoned, so there's no real connection, but it was a neat way to bring back an old name long before old names became in vogue in railroading. Now, for the two parts of this magazine that I thought were the most important, and I wanted to share with you. Number one, when you get to page 20, the article is Requiem for a Lightweight. And this is about Amtrak's probably least favorite train in its history, the Hlltopper. Now, we got to talk about the Hlltopper because there's nothing that makes passenger fans cringe than when they see the Hlltopper. And you got it right there on CP5 cam. That is an RF&P GP7 number 102 pulling the Hlltopper backwards. And that consists of exactly one coach and one Am Cafe, and those are Amfleet 1 cars, and a P30CH on the other end. So if anybody is counting, that is 4,500 horsepower to move exactly 2 Amfleet passenger cars. Not exactly the best use of horsepower. Now, to be clear, the P30CH is probably not providing power at that point. But the background of the Hlltopper is this: in the 1970s, after Amtrak had been created, West Virginia had some very powerful elected members of Congress. One was, of course, Robert Byrd, who served for a long time. And if you go to West Virginia, you'll see just about everything is named after Robert Byrd. There's a lot better improved highways and otherwise that you might expect in a state that has a relatively small population. That's because Robert Byrd was very good at bringing home a lot of bacon to his constituents. The other member who was incredibly powerful there was Harley Staggers. And of course, Harley Staggers, who we're going to talk about in another episode for the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, he was not someone who cared all that much, but he was going to do whatever he could for his state. So railroads weren't his thing, but doing something for his state was. So what the two of them did, and now this is more Byrd than Staggers, was supported the creation of a train called the Mountaineer. Now, the Mountaineer ran over the former N&W route that had been traveled by the Pocahontas and Powhatan Arrow between Norfolk and Cincinnati. But in reality, it didn't go all the way to Cincinnati on its own, and the Mountaineer ended up being a very short consist, usually 1 car, maybe 2, with an E unit, and they would operate to Catlettsburg, Kentucky, where it would be combined with the James Whitcomb Riley. The James Whitcomb Riley, which was the former Chesapeake and Ohio, George Washington between Washington and Cincinnati, and the former New York Central and Penn Central, James Whitcomb Riley between Cincinnati and Chicago, combined into one train and given the name of the poet, James Whitcomb Riley, would, and I believe it was Catlettsburg, Kentucky, where this would be connected on, the Mountaineer would be connected with the Riley and go to Chicago. Now, Amtrak, in its infinite wisdom in those days, decided at some point they were going to monkey around with the schedule of the Riley a little bit, and they did a lot of changes to that over the years. And one of those changes resulted in the Mountaineer no longer having a connection to the Riley itself. So if you wanted to go from someplace like Roanoke into Cincinnati or Indianapolis or even Chicago, you would have a long wait at some place that's not exactly conducive to that in order to do this. And so this is something that was typically happening before Amtrak, but reading closely to the history, you learn it happened extensively with Amtrak as well. So what did they do? They said, well, we're going to change this around a little bit more, and they created the Hlltopper. So the Mountaineer was replaced by the Hlltopper. The Hlltopper was a problem from the start. First of all, it operated, in order to go west, it operated south down the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, which is why in this photo, for those of you on CP5 cam, you see the RF&P GP7 on it, and it would go south of Richmond, which is the south end of the RF&P, to Petersburg, Virginia, on the seaboard coastline. And that meant it needed a separate crew. We're talking about now a second crew just to get from Richmond to Petersburg. Then at Petersburg, Virginia, it would pull onto the N&W. So now we're talking about the famed N&W main line that goes to Lynchburg and Roanoke out to Cincinnati and so forth. So then it needed another N&W crew to get it down that main, and then they had several going on from there. Now, as you can probably guess, this arrangement didn't work very well, in large part because not many people rode the train. It did have fairly good ridership in Virginia when it was operating on the RF&P and the I-95 corridor between Washington and Richmond, and then on the SCL as far as Petersburg. There were some other areas, Farmville, for example, because you have colleges there. You have colleges in Lynchburg. So there was, it did well there. But once you got beyond Roanoke, you ended up running into the same problem the N&W had, and why its passenger services didn't survive, which was that it was a relatively sparse population. And as time went on, that sparse population was taking advantage of the highways, which, for the way that you tend to live in rural areas, are much easier to utilize than a train, because at the end, when you get off the train, it's unlikely you're going to have rental cars or otherwise that are going to be waiting for you in small areas where these amenities simply don't exist at all. So many of the locals are not going to be using this as essential transportation, even though we might think that could be one of the more fertile areas for it. Nowadays, it's a little bit different because we do have the ability to have Ubers, and that it's a little bit more widespread, but not at this time. So there's this discussion. This article is by Don Phillips, a Potomac pundit. He was a legendary Washington, D.C. area reporter. He was with UPI and a variety of others. So he is the person that provided Trains Magazine with all of the great behind the scenes info about what was going on in Washington and how it affected the railroad industry. I was actually blessed back in 2017, after I lost my job, another time I lost my job, to go to a lunch where Wick Moorman spoke and sit at Don Phillips' table. How did I get there? I don't know. I didn't do anything special. I didn't play my I'm a Rail fan card. I just went there and they said, hey, sit here at the National Press Club. And sure enough, there is an older Don Phillips, and he is still active, by the way, sitting there and just, kind of spinning some of his railroad wisdom until things got cranked up. But it's basically Don Phillips' story, talking about his ride over the Hlltopper, on the Hlltopper, and everything that went on with it. I wanted to highlight an interesting quote here on page 22. He talks about on his way, his trip to Tri-State, which is Catlettsburg, Kentucky. He said, the luck of my seat selection was amazing. Sitting across from me were a well-dressed retired black man and his wife, Joe and Ella Alexander. He had been an N&W employee in the Bluefield Station and Yards for 28 years, and he too remembered the way it used to be. Now, he and his wife have to learn some new ways, including the first airplane rides of their lives. With 10 children and 16 grandchildren, the Alexanders do a lot of traveling. Quote, we used to live up on the hill, he reminisced in of his earlier days in Bluefield. And those 1200s would bring a train into town. They'd really talk to that mountain. He had spent almost half a lifetime loading and unloading trains pulled mainly by J's, and that's, of course, the 611, the J class. But the A class 2664s, like the 1218, which is at the Roanoke Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke, were his favorite. Now, it looks like we have lost our camera, so I am going to go ahead and bring the stream to a close. But I want to thank you for being with us today and really enjoying this time that we have here on the All Aboard podcast. And actually, I'll add one more thing briefly here. So the other part of this that I really liked, and so for those of you on CP5 cam, we're just going to do the rest of this with the picture of the Hlltopper there on the cover, but rest assured, the audio, the dulcet tones of my voice will continue to come through. After that conversation, there's a lot of discussion of the Hlltopper, and the thing that's so interesting is that Phillips, in order to get back to Washington, D.C., where he had to be, he didn't take the Hlltopper back. He took Piedmont Airlines. And so that was indicative of what Amtrak and passenger railroading as a whole were facing in those days. Now, the other big article that was here comes on page number 26, and it's entitled, "Whenever I Get Bored, I Think of the Greyhound." And the subtitle is "The Floridian Rolls to the End of the Line." This is by Judy Rosenfeld, who was a reporter with the Louisville Times. And it is a very much a bittersweet piece where she talks with passengers, talks with a former L&N engineer, or a currently then L&N engineer, and sees the inside and outside of the Floridian as it was rolling off its last miles. And so for me, reading this, it really was, it was so exciting in that you could see everything you love about traveling by train. Everything you love about traveling by train. But as you read on, you see all of the problems. You see the delays. You see the difficulties that they're having in operating the train. You see the fact that the schedule was so long. By the time this trip arrived in Miami, it was 2 hours behind schedule, and the trip from Louisville alone took 30 hours. And that's before you got into the delays that generally took place north of Louisville. So just the idea of this train, which had been such an important part of Amtrak, which had represented an achievement for them really from the get-go, was going away, and that it really did seem that Amtrak and the people who were running the company just didn't care enough, was kind of painful to read about. And so, the thing that typifies it the most is this quote early when they talk about Louisville being a shadow of more than 120 trains that passed through the Floridian, being a shadow daily in the 1920s. And those were names like Hummingbird, Southwind, George Washington, and Pan American. They all used to go through Louisville, but by this point, there was only one train which passed through twice a day, and that pretty much ran whenever it was possible to do so. So that shows you, again, how difficult passenger railroading was, and how bittersweet it was, and how many people really did depend on and desire to have these trains operating in some form, and the sadness that came with the fact that it no longer did. And the last thing I wanted to cover is on page 31. What do you mean it's depreciated? Why the GP30 is in a sense ageless. And this really encapsulates a lot of the things that we love to talk about on the All Aboard podcast, whether it is the financial side, the fact that a locomotive being 15 years old for a long time is considered to be completely depreciated and therefore obsolete, or if we're talking about the different services that were provided, all of the engineering and everything that went into it. So that was a terrific article because it covered all of those things, and it did it in a way that only Morgan can. And he weaved so many things together, but in a story-like format where you didn't think you were reading an industry journal. You didn't think you were reading something for so-called train nerds like me. It was like you were reading the most important bestseller on whatever list that you might look, and you would say, wow, that's interesting. And that was a talent that only David P. Morgan had, and that anybody was able to get out of Trains magazine, and something that all of the writers ultimately did under his tenure, which was to make it such that if somebody that wasn't a rail fan picked that magazine up and they really chose to read it in earnest, they wouldn't come away thinking that someone like me is a rail fan, quote unquote, nerd, but you would think, wow, there's something really interesting about what goes into all of those things, even if it didn't necessarily make them a fan. So I want to thank you for joining us today on the All Aboard podcast and putting up with some of our technical difficulties. And if you're a regular listener, you know that if we don't have some technical difficulties, then of course we have not had an episode of the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trains. Finally, the march that you heard coming in is the Marche Militaire Francaise, one of my favorite marches, and I was lucky to play that in high school when I was at Lincoln High School in Tallahassee, Florida. Where we did not get to see the Floridian come through, of course. So thanks again for being with us. It's 50 episodes, so I'm glad all of you have stuck with us during that time. Episode 51 will be starting on around 1 o'clock on the 5th of June. If you have any topics or otherwise that you'd like us to cover, please let me know, and we will be debuting a new segment in that coming up then. So thank you for being with us, and I hope you have a great day.